Hi, my name is Anastasia,
And I'm Kennedy.
and I'm going to be talking about Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was born into extreme deprivation and poverty in Köln-Molheim, a suburb of Köln, Germany, on May 26, 1883. He was the oldest of 13 children, and his father was an alcoholic with sadistic tendencies who brutalized both wife and children in the one-room apartment they all shared. This daily subjection to sexual violence must have had an immense influence on the boy who, aged 9, formed an unhealthy relationship with a dog catcher living in the same building, who introduced him to the practice of bestiality carried out initially on dogs. Kürten claims to have drowned 2 school friends at the age of 9. He apparently pushed one overboard, and then the second dived into his rescue. Then Kürten held both underwater until they had suffocated. At the time, the event was just dismissed as a tragic childhood accident. As Kürten matured sexually, his bestiality extended to sheep, goats, and other farm animals, with the teenager discovering particular pleasure with the animal was stabbed during intercourse. By 1899, at the age of 16, Kürten had progressed to petty crime and ran away from home to escape the continuing violence. Shortly after his departure, his father was arrested for incestuous relationships with his daughter, Kürten's sister, who was only 13, and he was jailed for 3 years. Kürten's petty crimes soon led to the first of many short prison sentences for various misdemeanors that punctuated his existence over the following years. The appalling conditions within the prison confirmed his sadistic tendencies, which he now transferred from farm animals to humans. With each successive sentence, Kürten's rage against society and his capacity for depravity increased. He discovered a fascination for brutal sexual acts while in solitary confinement, which enhanced his fantasies. So much so that he began to break prison rules to ensure the maximum time in solitary confinement. During his periods of release between prison, Kürten was responsible for various sexual assaults, but his first documented murder victim was 10-year-old Christine Klein. Klein was sexually assaulted and stabbed in her home in Köln on May 25, 1913, while her parents worked in their pub below her bedroom. Her uncle, who had an argument with her father, immediately came under suspicion, and Kürten, who returned to the scene of the crime the next day, was enthralled by the horror the killing had invoked in the locals, especially when the sexual assault came to light. The innocent uncle was cleared of the murder given the lack of evidence, but Kürten followed his trial with interest, whetting his sadistic appetite for suffering in others. Kürten was called up for military service following the start of World War I, but military discipline did not suit him, and he deserted from his barracks. He was jailed when captured and remained in prison until 1921, his longest sentence to date, and his rage at this injustice intensified. Following his release from prison, he moved to Altenburg, where he met and married a former prostitute who had been jailed for the murder of her fiancé. He spent the next 4 years living a life of relative normality, and found work as a molder, which was also his father's profession. And he even became active in the trade union. This normality was short-lived, however, and Kürten found himself inexorably drawn to Dusseldorf, where his criminal tendencies escalated, from petty crimes to arson attacks and then to sexual attacks, 4 of which are certainly attributable to him in the period up until early 1929. One lucky victim, Maria Kuhn, survived repeated stabbing by Kürten that caused 24 individual wounds. This crime escalation reached its peak in the killing of 9-year-old Rosa Oliger on February 9, 1929. She was stabbed 13 times by Kürten, who climaxed during the brutal attack before he dumped her body under a hedge, then attempted to set fire to her remains to destroy the evidence. Rosa was the first of a number of victims that included young girls, women, and even men over the next 15 months. A 45-year-old mechanic named Shear followed 5 days later, the victim of multiple stab wounds. Kürten again returned to the scene of the crime to relive the moment, even speaking to detectives about the murder. Sensationalist German press covered the attacks extensively, and when they discovered that investigators believed that the attacker might be drinking the blood of his victims, he was immortalized in print as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. The search for the killer received a major setback, however, when a learning disabled individual named Stausberg, accused of similar crimes, inexplicably admitted to all of the so-called vampire killings. He was committed to an asylum, and the police were convinced that the case was solved. However, by August 1929, it became apparent that their conviction was premature. A series of strangulations and stabbings occurred, culminating in the brutal fairground murder of foster sisters, 5-year-old Gertrude Hamaker and 14-year-old Louise Lenzen. The next day, Kürten assaulted another woman, Gertrude Schult, who survived the attack and gave police a description of her attacker as a pleasant-looking male around 40 years old. Attacks became more frequent and were widely publicized, throwing the population of Dusseldorf into a panic as the victim count rocketed. Ida Reuter was raped and killed in September, and a servant girl named Elizabeth Dorier was battered to death on October 12, 1929. 2 other victims named Murrer and Wanders were fortunate to survive brutal hammer attacks, but the very nondescript appearance of Kürten, as described by his victims, made it difficult to narrow down the list of potential suspects. Kürten enjoyed the mass hysteria and horror enormously, feeding off the press attention. He even went as far to contact a newspaper on November 29th with a map detailing the position of the body of his latest victim, Gertrude Alberman, a 5-year-old he had stabbed to death 2 days before, dumping her body under some rubble. Kürten's attacks continued into that winter and the spring of 1930, but none were fatal, surviving only to escalate the horror. Harrowing survivor attacks provided lurid copy for newspapers, an antidote to the growing economic deprivations being inflicted by the Great Depression. Public condemnation of the authorities for failing to catch the killer was widespread. May 14, 1930, saw the start of a chain of events that would result in Kürten's eventual capture. He offered a young, unemployed woman, Maria Budlick, somewhere to stay, and took her to his apartment, hoping to have sex with her. When she refused, he agreed to find her somewhere else to stay, but on returning her to the train station, he took her into the nearby forest and raped her before letting her go. Throughout Kürten's reign of terror, he maintained a fond attachment to his wife and, recognizing that he would eventually be caught for the rape of Budlick, now that the police knew his identity, he devised a plan to ensure her financial security following his arrest. He confessed to her that he was the Dusseldorf vampire, detailing all the killings and attacks, and he insisted that she would be paid a large reward for turning him over to the authorities. On May 24, 1930, Frau Kürten reluctantly did as he, her husband, advised, and took the police to her designated Rendezvous site, a local church where Kürten surrendered quietly. Once under arrest, Kürten provided an astonishingly detailed account of his string of crimes to Professor Karl Berg, a distinguished psychologist, who later published the confession in a book entitled The Sadist. He claimed 79 individual acts of crime in all, and went to great lengths to convince the authorities of his guilt, perhaps in the hope of his full cooperation would ensure the maximum financial benefit for his wife. His memory was nearly photographic, and his recollection of each offense obviously provided him with great pleasure, less so the attending stenographers. Kürten's trial commenced on April 13th, 1931, on charges including 9 murders and 7 attempted murders. The outward appearances, a successful businessman in a well-tailored suit, he initially retracted his expensive confession, claiming that he had sought only to ensure his wife's financial security. However, exhaustive questioning by the examining magistrate and a damning litany of evidence over the subsequent 2 months caused him to eventually admit guilt while under interrogation. In an emotionless voice, Kürten claimed that his childhood and the German penal system was responsible for releasing his sadistic tendencies, and he showed no remorse for his crimes. The jury took only 90 minutes to return a verdict of guilt on all accounts, and Kürten received 9 death sentences. He was executed by guillotine on July 2nd, 1931, in Köln, Germany. So how do you feel about that?
Okay, so based on what you said, he's been corrupt since childhood.
Yeah.
With his father and then with the, I believe, neighbor? Was the neighbor?
Yeah. Because he was having sex with animals because his neighbor was as well.
Okay. Then with the drowning of the children.
Yeah.
Then he married the prostitute. Then, what else?
And then he ended up killing, I want to say 30 people.
Okay.
I mean, that could be a high number, but it's also possible that he hasn't admitted to a bunch of them, which is crazy to me. But I mean, he honestly showed no remorse for how many times that he had killed these people.
Basically, I think he showed no remorse because of what he grew up around.
Yeah.
So he's like I grew up bad, so I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, so his last words were, "After my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures."
So he was just mentally messed up in the head.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think his fascination was blood and gore, and he really was into bestiality. He was really into linking sex and death together.
Yep.
And that is crazy to think about, because that's why he said that as his last words, because he knew that blood was his pleasure. And that's his words. That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures. To me, that's so crazy. And the worst part is that he never had kids either, but it kind of makes me glad that he didn't have kids, because if he did, he probably would have done the same thing his father did, and it would just be a never-ending cycle.
Right.
So I mean,
when did he get or when was he arrested? When was the trial?
The trial was, I believe, in April. Hold on. Okay, so the trial was on April 13th, 1931. So this was a pretty early case, so they didn't really have lawyers back then. So he pretty much represented himself.
Basically. And
the only reason he turned himself in was because he wanted his wife to get money from his arrest. Because he was thinking if she turned him in, she would get money for it because the police had been looking for him. But in that case, it didn't happen. She got no money. Basically, he just turned himself in for no reason. And then he tried to backtrack and was like, "No, it wasn't me. I just wanted my family."
Wait.
Yeah.
So he turned himself in so the wife could receive money.
Yeah.
Oh, so this was this was a hit out for his arrest?
Yeah.
The little alive or death? Okay, so he turned himself in. The wife didn't receive any money, so he tried to take it back.
Yeah. He was like, "No, I didn't do it. I just wanted my wife to be financially stable. That's all I wanted." And then the police didn't believe him because he had so much evidence against him. But it's like one of those things where he looks like an unlikely suspect until you really start looking at it, and then they were like, this makes so much sense. And his father obviously had nothing to do with this, because I'm pretty sure he died before the trial even began. But yeah, he ended up getting chopped off, like his head got chopped off. So yeah, that was crazy, and the fact that it only took the jury 90 minutes to
because of what he came from, like his background.
Yeah.
Like you take one, like you like read one sentence of that, and be like, ooh, guilty.
Exactly.
So
like, I think, you know, with like a similar case like Jodi Arias, it took the jury like 5 hours to come back the first time, and then they were like, we can't figure something out. And then the judge was like, that's not okay. Like, if you can't agree, then you got to go back and try to agree. With this, though, it was like, everything is clear. They wanted him out of the way.
Basically.
Yeah. And with some of these death penalty cases, it's like, some of them do make sense. Like this one, I totally agree, because if he were alive during this day and this case was happening now, I would be like, you know, like, go all the way, because there's no way. I mean, at that point, if he goes to jail and he doesn't get the death penalty, he would just get free food,
basically.
You know,
free housing,
everything. He would still get to see his wife.
Yep.
You know, he would still somehow be able to give her money and things like that.
And plus, the mentality doesn't change.
Exactly.
So even if he were to get out or rot in jail, he still has the mentality of sex and blood.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. Which, to me, I haven't heard of anyone like this now. Because I think, honestly, especially since this was in Germany, I don't know how bad the economy was at the time. I know they talked about Great Depression, so that was probably making things worse, with the fact that,
especially after the war.
Yeah. I mean, at that point, I think Germany was in a state of depression, and they were, you know, lacking a lot of things, including money, and that's why I think he wanted financial stability.
Right.
All right, well, that's going to be it for Peter Kürten. Thank you for listening.